Marcus Hayes had seen combat in 7 countries and survived 3 tours with the Navy SEALs, but nothing prepared him for what happened on his own driveway that Tuesday evening in suburban Virginia. He had just returned from a meeting at the Naval Special Warfare Command in Norfolk and was still wearing his service uniform with all his ribbons and medals clearly visible when Officer Derek Sullivan and his partner Katie Morrison pulled up in their patrol car. Marcus had been checking his mailbox and talking to the elderly couple who lived next door when someone called the police about a suspicious person in the neighborhood. The suspicious person was Marcus, who had lived in this house for 5 years and knew every neighbor by name. Sullivan stepped out of the car with his hand resting on his weapon, and his face showed an expression that Marcus had seen too many times before. It was the look of someone who had already decided what kind of person Marcus was before asking a single question. Morrison followed behind, looking uncertain, but she stayed quiet and let her partner take the lead. Marcus stood calmly on his driveway with his keys in one hand and his phone in the other, as Sullivan walked toward him with aggressive strides. The officer demanded identification without introducing himself or explaining why he was there. Marcus kept his voice calm and respectful as he explained that he lived here and was just coming home from work. He slowly reached for his wallet, making sure to keep his movements visible and deliberate because he knew how quickly situations like this could turn dangerous. Sullivan barely glanced at the military identification card that Marcus handed him. Instead, he asked why Marcus was walking around looking at houses, and Marcus explained again that he lived here and had been checking his mail. The elderly neighbors who had been talking to Marcus just moments before were now watching from their porch, but they stayed silent. Sullivan kept asking questions with an aggressive tone, asking where Marcus worked and what he was doing in the neighborhood. Marcus answered each question patiently, explaining that he was a lieutenant commander in the Navy and had just returned from a meeting at the base. His uniform should have made this obvious, but Sullivan seemed determined to find something wrong. The situation escalated when Sullivan told Marcus to turn around and place his hands behind his back. Marcus asked what he was being arrested for, and Sullivan barked that he was being detained for suspicious activity. Marcus knew his rights, and he knew this was wrong, but he also knew that arguing with an aggressive officer on the street rarely ended well. He started to comply, but as he turned, Sullivan grabbed his arm roughly and twisted it behind his back with unnecessary force. The movement was so sudden and so aggressive that Marcus instinctively shifted his weight to maintain his balance. It was a natural reaction that anyone would have when grabbed unexpectedly, but Sullivan interpreted it as resistance. Within seconds, Marcus was face down on his own driveway with Sullivan's knee pressed hard against his spine. Morrison moved in to help secure his other arm, and Marcus heard Sullivan yelling that he was resisting arrest. Marcus kept his hands visible and did not fight back, even though every instinct from his military training was screaming at him to defend himself. He forced himself to stay calm and compliant because he knew that any movement could be used against him. The concrete was rough against his cheek, and he could feel his keys digging into his hip as Sullivan put handcuffs on him so tight that they cut into his wrists. His wife, Lisa, came running out of the house when she heard the commotion, and her face went pale with shock when she saw Marcus on the ground. She started to approach, but Morrison held up a hand and told her to stay back. Their 8-year-old daughter, Sophie, appeared at the front window, and Marcus could see her crying as she watched her father being treated like a criminal. That image would haunt him for months afterward because he had spent years fighting to protect his family and his country. But now they were seeing him helpless and humiliated on their own property. Lisa was demanding to know what was happening and trying to explain that Marcus lived here, but Sullivan ignored her completely. Sullivan hauled Marcus to his feet with rough movements and pushed him toward the patrol car. Marcus remained silent, knowing that anything he said could be twisted and used against him later. He caught Lisa's eye as he was placed in the back of the car and tried to convey that he was okay and that she should call their lawyer. The neighbors were all watching now, and some had their phones out recording the scene. Marcus hoped that someone had captured what really happened because he knew that Sullivan's version of events would be very different from the truth at all. The police station Marcus was processed and fingerprinted like a common criminal. Sullivan wrote a report claiming that Marcus had been acting suspiciously and had become aggressive when questioned. According to Sullivan's version, Marcus had used military training to resist arrest and had attempted to assault an officer. Morrison signed off on the report without changing a word, even though she had seen exactly what happened. Marcus was charged with resisting arrest, assaulting a police officer, and disorderly conduct. The bail was set at $10,000, and Marcus spent the night in a cell, thinking about how quickly his life had been turned upside down. Lisa arrived early, the next morning with a bail bondsman, and Marcus was released. The drive home was silent because there were no words for what had happened. When they got back to the house, Marcus saw that one of his neighbors had left a note saying they had footage from their security camera. The camera had captured the entire encounter from the moment Sullivan arrived until Marcus was put in the patrol car. Marcus watched the video and saw clearly that he had done nothing wrong. He had been calm and cooperative throughout the encounter, and his slight weight shift when Sullivan grabbed him was barely visible. The video showed Sullivan's aggression and unnecessary use of force, but Marcus knew that video evidence did not always matter when it came to cases like this. His commanding officer called the next day, offering support and asking if there was anything the Navy could do. Marcus appreciated the gesture, but he knew that military brass usually stayed out of civilian legal matters. He hired a public defender named Helen Barnett because he could not afford a private attorney on his Navy salary. Helen was overworked and handling 30 other cases, but she believed his story and promised to fight for him. She warned him, though, that cases like this were difficult because juries tended to believe police officers over defendants regardless of the evidence. Marcus prepared himself for a long battle, knowing that his reputation and his career were on the line. Everything he had worked for and sacrificed could be destroyed by one corrupt officer and a system that seemed designed to protect the police rather than seek the truth. 6 months passed between the arrest and the trial, and those months were the hardest of Marcus's life. He continued working at his Navy position, but the charges hung over him like a dark cloud affecting everything he did. His security clearance was under review because of the pending criminal case, and some of his assignments were put on hold. His fellow officers supported him publicly, but Marcus could sense the doubt in some of their eyes because people always wondered if there might be some truth to criminal charges even when they came from questionable sources. Lisa stood by him without hesitation, but the stress was taking its toll on their marriage, and their daughter Sophie was having nightmares about police coming to take her father away again. Helen Barnett did her best to prepare a strong defense, but she was honest with Marcus about the challenges they faced. The system was not designed to favor defendants, especially when those defendants were accused of assaulting police officers. Juries tended to trust law enforcement, and prosecutors knew how to use that trust to their advantage. Helen had requested the security camera footage from Marcus's neighbor, and it clearly showed that Sullivan had been the aggressor, but the quality of the video had mysteriously degraded when it was submitted into evidence. The clear footage Marcus had seen at home now looked grainy and unclear, making it harder to see exactly what had happened. Helen suspected tampering, but proving that in court would be almost impossible. Sullivan had submitted his official report, which painted a picture of Marcus as a dangerous and aggressive individual who had refused to cooperate and had used military combat training to resist arrest. Morrison had signed off on every detail, backing up her partner's story completely. The prosecutor assigned to the case was Daniel Green, who had a reputation for being tough on crime and for supporting law enforcement. Green seemed determined to make an example of Marcus, perhaps to send a message that attacking police officers would not be tolerated regardless of who you were or what uniform you wore. Helen tried to negotiate a plea deal that would avoid jail time, but Green refused, saying that the charges were too serious and that Marcus needed to face the full consequences of his actions. As the trial date approached, Marcus prepared himself mentally for what was coming. He knew that his military service and his decorations might count for something, but he also knew that the system did not always reward service or sacrifice. He had seen too many good people destroyed by legal battles they could not afford to fight, and by prosecutors who cared more about conviction rates than about justice. The Fairfax County Courthouse was a large, imposing building that processed hundreds of cases every day, and Marcus was just another defendant, waiting for his turn to face judgment. The morning of the trial, Marcus put on his best civilian suit and tried to look confident even though his stomach was churning with anxiety. Lisa sat beside him in the courtroom gallery, along with several of his Navy teammates who had taken leave to be there. Commander Jack Bennett, his former commanding officer, was there too, and Marcus appreciated the show of support, even though he knew it might not matter. The judge assigned to the case was Patricia Monroe, who had a reputation for being fair but strict. She ran her courtroom with firm control and did not tolerate nonsense from either side. Marcus had researched her previous decisions and found that she generally sided with law enforcement, but also held officers accountable when there was clear evidence of misconduct. What Marcus did not know was that someone else was watching from the back of the courtroom. Vice Admiral Richard Cole had heard about the case through military channels and had decided to observe the proceedings himself. Cole was the commander of Naval Special Warfare Command, and he had enough rank and influence to make things happen when necessary. He sat in the back row wearing civilian clothes and a baseball cap pulled low so that no one would recognize him. He wanted to see for himself what was happening to one of his officers before deciding whether to get involved. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Monroe entered, taking her seat at the bench. She looked over the courtroom with a stern expression and began by outlining the charges against Marcus: resisting arrest, assaulting a police officer, and disorderly conduct. Each charge carried potential jail time, and a conviction would likely end Marcus's military career. Helen stood and entered a plea of not guilty on all counts, and Judge Monroe scheduled the trial to begin immediately with jury selection. The jury selection process took most of the morning, and Marcus watched carefully as potential jurors were questioned by both sides. Green used his challenges to eliminate anyone who seemed sympathetic to defendants or skeptical of police, while Helen tried to find jurors who could be objective and fair. The final jury consisted of 7 women and 5 men representing a range of ages and backgrounds. Marcus tried to read their faces, but it was impossible to tell what they were thinking. Some looked at him with curiosity, while others avoided eye contact completely. After a lunch break, the trial began with opening statements. Green went first, and he painted a dramatic picture of a dangerous individual who had attacked brave police officers doing their duty. He described Marcus's military training as if it made him a threat to public safety, and suggested that his combat experience had made him unstable and prone to violence. He promised to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Marcus had assaulted Officer Sullivan and had endangered both officers through his aggressive behavior. Green spoke with confidence and authority, and Marcus could see several jurors nodding along with his narrative. Helen's opening statement was more subdued, but no less powerful. She explained that Marcus was a decorated Navy SEAL who had served his country with honor and distinction. She described the events of that evening and how Marcus had been cooperative and respectful throughout the encounter. She told the jury about the security camera footage that would show the truth of what happened, and she asked them to judge the case based on evidence rather than assumptions. Helen spoke with sincerity, but Marcus could tell she was outmatched by Green's showmanship and by the natural advantage prosecutors had in cases like this. The prosecution's first witness was Sullivan himself, and the officer walked to the stand with obvious confidence. He was wearing his dress uniform with all his badges and commendations displayed, and he looked like the very picture of a professional law enforcement officer. Green led him through his testimony with practiced ease, asking questions that allowed Sullivan to tell his version of events without interruption. Sullivan described responding to a call about suspicious activity and finding Marcus acting strangely in the neighborhood. He claimed that Marcus had been evasive when questioned and had refused to provide proper identification. According to Sullivan, Marcus had become aggressive and had used what appeared to be military combat moves to resist when Sullivan tried to detain him for everyone's safety. Marcus sat and listened to the lies with growing frustration, but he kept his face neutral and his posture calm. He knew that showing emotion would only hurt his case and that he had to trust the process even though every instinct told him the system was failing. Sullivan finished his testimony with a statement about how difficult and dangerous police work was, and how officers had to make split-second decisions to protect themselves and the public. Several jurors looked sympathetic, and Marcus felt his hope beginning to fade. The system was working exactly as it was designed to work, and he was just another person being processed through it, regardless of the truth. The second day of trial began with Marcus taking the stand in his own defense. He had spent the previous evening rehearsing his testimony with Helen, but no amount of preparation could fully ready him for the experience of sitting in that chair while facing a hostile prosecutor. Helen led him through his version of events, starting with his background and military service. Marcus described his career with the Navy SEALs and the various decorations he had earned. including a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart. He explained that his training emphasized discipline and de-escalation and that he knew how to handle confrontational situations without resorting to violence. Marcus described the events of that evening in careful detail. He explained that he had been checking his mail and talking to neighbors when the patrol car arrived. He described how he had immediately complied with Sullivan's request for identification and had remained calm and respectful throughout the encounter. Marcus explained that he had not refused to cooperate or made any threatening moves. He described the moment when Sullivan grabbed his arm roughly and how he had simply shifted his weight to avoid falling. Marcus emphasized that this was a natural reflex that anyone would have, and that it did not constitute resistance or aggression. He described being thrown to the ground and handcuffed while his wife and daughter watched. In horror from their home, Helen asked Marcus about his understanding of proper police procedure, and Marcus explained that his military experience had included training on rules of engagement and appropriate use of force. He stated that Sullivan's actions had been excessive and unnecessary, given that Marcus had been fully cooperative. Helen showed Marcus the security camera footage and asked him to describe what he saw. Marcus pointed out his calm demeanor and his immediate compliance with Sullivan's requests. He noted the rough grab and the violent takedown and explained that nothing in his behavior had justified that level of force. The jury listened attentively, and Marcus allowed himself to hope that they could see the truth of what had happened. Then Green stood for cross-examination, and Marcus braced himself for what was coming. The prosecutor began by questioning Marcus's military record, asking about his deployments and combat experience. Green made it sound like Marcus's service was a liability rather than an asset, and suggested that combat had changed him in dangerous ways. He asked if Marcus had ever killed anyone, and Marcus answered truthfully that he had engaged enemy combatants in the line of duty. Green asked if killing had become easy for him, and Marcus firmly stated that taking a life was never easy, and that every service member carried the weight of those decisions. But Green had already planted the seed in the jury's minds that Marcus was a trained killer who might be unstable. Green moved on to the events of the arrest, asking Marcus to admit that he had moved when Sullivan grabbed him. Marcus explained again that it had been a reflexive movement to maintain balance and that any person would react the same way when grabbed suddenly. Green asked if Marcus's reflexes were enhanced by his military training, and Marcus said that his training emphasized control and discipline, not aggression. Green then asked a question that made Marcus's blood run cold. He asked if Marcus had felt angry when Sullivan arrested him, and if that anger had led to him resisting. Marcus answered honestly that he had been frustrated by the unjust treatment, but had remained calm and cooperative. Green twisted that answer, suggesting that Marcus's admission of frustration proved he had been in an aggressive state of mind. The cross-examination continued, with Green asking increasingly hostile questions designed to make Marcus look dangerous and untrustworthy. He asked about other encounters Marcus had with police, and Marcus explained that he had never been arrested before and had always been respectful toward law enforcement. Green asked if Marcus thought he was above the law because of his military service, and Marcus firmly denied that. He asked if Marcus resented authority figures, and Marcus explained that his entire career was built on following orders and respecting the chain of command. But no matter how Marcus answered, Green found ways to make his responses sound suspicious or evasive. The final blow came when Green asked Marcus about his training in hand-to-hand combat. Marcus admitted that he was trained in various martial arts and combat techniques as part of his Navy SEAL qualification. Green asked him to describe some of those techniques, and Marcus reluctantly explained basic defensive moves. Green then asked if those techniques could be used to hurt or kill someone, and Marcus had to admit that they could if used offensively. Green turned to the jury and said that they had just heard from a man who admitted to being a trained killer with the skills to seriously injure police officers. He asked Marcus directly if he had used those skills against Sullivan, and Marcus stated firmly that he had not. But the damage was done, and Marcus could see doubt in several jurors' faces. When Marcus stepped down from the witness stand, he felt drained and defeated. Helen tried to reassure him that his testimony had been strong, but they both knew that Green had scored significant points. The prosecution rested its case, and Helen called a few character witnesses, including Commander Bennett, who testified about Marcus's exemplary service record and strong character. But character witnesses could only do so much when the core issue was whether the jury believed Marcus or Sullivan. The afternoon dragged on with closing arguments scheduled for the next morning. Marcus sat at the defense table feeling like he was watching his life fall apart in slow motion. Sullivan sat at the prosecution table with a satisfied expression that made Marcus want to leap across the room. The officer had successfully painted Marcus as a dangerous individual who posed a threat to public safety. He had used Marcus's own service and training against him, and had made those things seem like evidence of guilt rather than dedication. Marcus thought about all the times he had put his life on line for his country, and realized that none of it mattered in this room. His medals and his scars and his years of sacrifice were meaningless when set against the word of a police officer who was willing to lie under oath. When court adjourned, Lisa hugged Marcus tightly in the hallway, and he could feel her trembling. She asked how he thought it had gone, and Marcus did not have the heart to tell her the truth. He said that Helen had done a good job, and that they had presented their case well. But inside he was preparing himself for the worst. He had seen enough of the trial to know which way it was leaning, and he knew that juries rarely sided with defendants in cases like this. Tomorrow would bring closing arguments, and then the jury would deliberate. Marcus tried to stay hopeful, but hope was becoming harder to hold on to with each passing hour. That night, Marcus could not sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling while Lisa slept fitfully beside him. He thought about Sophie and what a conviction would mean for her. She would grow up knowing that her father had been labeled a criminal, and that their family had been destroyed by a system that was supposed to protect them. He thought about his Navy career and how years of service could be erased by one corrupt officer and a prosecutor who cared more about winning than about justice. Most of all, he thought about the future, and how different it looked now, compared to a year ago when his biggest concern had been his next deployment. Marcus got up quietly and went to his home office where he kept his military decorations and photos from his service. He looked at pictures of himself and his teammates in various locations around the world. Young faces full of determination and purpose. He remembered the bonds they had formed and the mission they had believed in, protecting freedom and defending the innocent. But now Marcus wondered if those ideals had any real meaning. If the system at home was broken, then what were they actually fighting for overseas? The question haunted him as he sat alone in the darkness, waiting for dawn and for whatever verdict the next day would bring. What Marcus did not know was that while he sat alone, questioning everything he believed in, powerful forces were already moving to help him. Vice Admiral Cole had spent the previous day making phone calls and pulling strings. The Navy's top legal team was preparing to enter the case, and media outlets were being alerted to the story. By morning, everything would change, but Marcus had no way of knowing that. He sat in his office consumed by despair and preparing himself for the worst. The breaking point had been reached, and Marcus felt like he had nothing left to give. But sometimes when things seem darkest, help arrives from unexpected places, and one phone call can turn the tide of battle. Vice Admiral Richard Cole had not planned to get involved in a civilian criminal case, but sometimes duty required action even when it was uncomfortable or politically risky. He had spent enough time in the courtroom watching the proceedings to understand exactly what was happening to Marcus Hayes. This was not justice. This was a railroad job carried out by a corrupt officer and enabled by a system that protected its own. Cole had seen too many good people destroyed by circumstances beyond their control, and he was not willing to let it happen to one of the finest officers he had ever commanded. The call he made from the courthouse parking lot was to Captain Sarah Norton, who served as one of the Navy's top judge advocate generals for the Eastern region. Norton was known for being brilliant in the courtroom and absolutely fearless when it came to defending military personnel. Cole explained the situation in clear terms, describing what he had witnessed and emphasizing that this was not just about one officer. This was about sending a message that the Navy stood behind its people and would not tolerate injustice. Norton listened carefully, asking pointed questions about the evidence and the proceedings. When Cole finished, she promised to mobilize her team immediately. But Cole did not stop with one call. He knew that legal representation alone might not be enough to turn the tide. He needed to apply pressure from multiple directions and to make it clear that this case had implications beyond one courtroom in Virginia. His next call was to the Pentagon and specifically to the office of the Secretary of the Navy. Cole had enough seniority and credibility to get through quickly, and when he did, he laid out the situation in stark terms. A decorated Navy SEAL with multiple combat deployments and commendations was being prosecuted on false charges filed by a police officer with a history of excessive force complaints. The case was a miscarriage of justice, and it threatened to undermine trust between military personnel and civilian law enforcement. The response from the Secretary's office was immediate and decisive. Within hours, a plan was put in motion to provide Marcus with the best possible defense and to make it clear that the Navy would not stand by while one of its officers was railroaded. The Secretary authorized a public statement expressing concern about the case and reaffirming the Navy's commitment to supporting its personnel. The statement was carefully worded to avoid prejudicing the trial, but it sent a clear message that powerful people were watching and that any misconduct would be investigated thoroughly. By evening, the statement had been released to major news outlets and the story was beginning to gain national attention. Captain Norton spent that night assembling her team and preparing for battle. She brought in 2 senior military attorneys with extensive trial experience, and they divided up the work of reviewing every document and piece of evidence in the case. They obtained the original security camera footage from Marcus's neighbor and brought in technical experts to analyze how and why the quality had degraded when it entered the evidence system. The experts confirmed what Norton suspected. The file had been deliberately compressed and degraded to reduce its clarity. With their enhanced restoration techniques, they were able to recover the original quality and create a version that showed exactly what had happened that night. Norton also dug into Sullivan's background and discovered a pattern that should have disqualified him from testifying. He had been involved in 3 previous excessive force incidents, and in 2 of them, he had filed criminal charges against the suspects claiming they had attacked him. In both cases, video evidence had later contradicted his testimony, but the charges had been quietly dropped, and Sullivan had faced no consequences. This was exactly the kind of pattern that juries needed to see, because it established that Sullivan had a history of lying under oath to cover up his own misconduct. Norton prepared exhibits and witness statements that would blow Sullivan's credibility apart. Meanwhile, the media coverage was beginning to build momentum. Local news outlets picked up the story about the Navy SEAL facing trial, and several reporters started asking questions about Sullivan's record and the police department's handling of excessive force complaints. By morning, the courthouse steps were packed with cameras and reporters. What had been a quiet case that Sullivan and Green expected to handle routinely had suddenly become a national story about police accountability and the treatment of veterans. The pressure was mounting, and everyone involved knew that the outcome would have implications far beyond Marcus. Hayes. Cole made several more calls that evening, reaching out to senior officers who had worked with Marcus and asking them to attend the trial if possible. By morning, a dozen high-ranking Navy officers had arranged to be present in the courtroom. Their presence would send a powerful message about how seriously the military took this case. Cole also contacted veterans advocacy groups and civil rights organizations, alerting them to the case and asking for their support. The response was overwhelming, with multiple organizations offering to file friend of the court briefs and to provide additional resources for Marcus's defense. Marcus knew nothing about any of this as he sat alone in his office that night. He had no idea that powerful forces were mobilizing on his behalf, or that help was coming from directions he never expected. All he knew was despair and the crushing weight of injustice. But that was about to change. When he arrived at the courthouse the next morning, he would find that everything had shifted. The balance of power that had seemed so firmly tilted against him was about to swing in a dramatic new direction. One call had indeed turned the tide, but it was more than just one call. It was a coordinated effort by people who believed in doing what was right and who refused to let a good man be destroyed by a corrupt system. Norton finished her preparations around 3 in the morning and caught a few hours of sleep before heading to the courthouse. She knew that what she was about to do would make enemies and might have political consequences, but she did not care. She had taken an oath to defend justice, and she intended to honor that oath. As she drove through the dark streets toward Fairfax, she thought about all the people who had been chewed up by a system that valued convictions over truth. She thought about Marcus sitting in his home believing that all hope was lost, and she smiled because he was about to learn that sometimes hope arrives when you least expect it. The sun was just beginning to rise when Norton arrived at the courthouse, and she saw the crowd of reporters already gathering. News vans lined the street and cameras were being set up for live broadcasts. The story had exploded overnight thanks to the Navy's statement and the social media attention it had generated. Norton felt a surge of satisfaction because this kind of attention was exactly what was needed. Prosecutors and judges might ignore a single defendant with a public defender, but they could not ignore a case that had become a national flashpoint. The pressure would force everyone to be more careful and more honest. It would level the playing field in ways that legal arguments alone never could. Inside the courthouse, Norton met with Helen Barnett and explained that she was there to assist with the defense. Helen was initially skeptical, wondering if this was some kind of political stunt, but Norton quickly won her over by demonstrating her thorough knowledge of the case and her genuine commitment to defending Marcus. They spent an hour reviewing strategy and evidence before Marcus arrived. When Marcus walked in and saw Norton in her Navy dress uniform standing beside Helen, he looked confused and uncertain. Norton extended her hand and introduced herself, explaining that the Navy had assigned her to ensure he received the defense he deserved. Marcus looked like he might cry, but he maintained his composure and thanked her with a firm handshake. Norton briefed Marcus on what to expect and showed him the enhanced video footage and the evidence about Sullivan's past misconduct. For the first time since the trial began, Marcus felt something other than despair. He felt hope stirring in his chest like a fire that had been reduced to embers suddenly catching a fresh breeze. Norton explained that they were going to recall Sullivan to the stand, and that this time the cross-examination would be very different. She told Marcus that they had assembled evidence that would destroy Sullivan's credibility and expose the truth of what happened. Marcus listened carefully, and for the first time in months he allowed himself to believe that justice might actually prevail. When they walked into the courtroom together, Marcus immediately noticed the changes. The gallery was packed with Navy officers in uniform, and the media presence was overwhelming. Judge Monroe looked surprised but maintained her professional composure. Green looked worried, and Sullivan, who had been so confident the day before, now seemed uncertain. The balance had shifted, and everyone in the room could feel it. Norton formally entered her appearance as counsel, and Judge Monroe approved it over Green's objections. The tide had turned, and the battle was about to begin in earnest. Marcus took his seat at the defense table, and for the first time since this nightmare began, he felt like he had a real chance at justice. Judge Monroe called the court to order, and the atmosphere in the room was electric with anticipation. Norton stood and addressed the judge, requesting permission to recall Officer Sullivan for additional cross-examination. Green objected strenuously, arguing that Sullivan had already testified and that the defense had completed its cross-examination. But Norton calmly explained that new evidence had come to light that needed to be addressed and that the defense had the right to present this evidence to the jury. Judge Monroe considered the request carefully and then overruled Green's objection. Sullivan was called back to the stand, and as he walked forward, Marcus could see that the officer's confidence had been replaced by visible nervousness. Norton began her questioning in a calm, professional tone that somehow made her words even more devastating. She started by asking Sullivan to confirm his earlier testimony about Marcus's behavior, and Sullivan repeated his claims about aggression and resistance. Then Norton walked to the evidence table and picked up a tablet computer. She asked the judge for permission to introduce new evidence, and after a brief discussion, the judge allowed it. Norton explained that the defense had obtained a digitally enhanced version of the security camera footage using expert restoration techniques. The original video had been degraded, but the experts had been able to recover the full quality and clarity that had somehow been lost when the video entered evidence. The enhanced video was played on the courtroom monitors, and this time there was absolutely no ambiguity about what had happened. The footage showed Marcus standing calmly on his driveway with his hands visible and no threatening posture. It showed him immediately complying when Sullivan asked for identification and producing his military identification card within seconds. It showed Sullivan grabbing Marcus's arm roughly without any provocation, and Marcus making the slightest weight shift to maintain his balance. The movement was barely perceptible and completely natural. Then it showed Sullivan violently taking Marcus down to the ground, using force that was clearly excessive given Marcus's cooperative behavior. The courtroom was silent as the video played, and when it ended, several jurors were shaking their heads. Norton turned back to Sullivan and her voice was ice cold. "Officer Sullivan, you testified that Commander Hayes refused to provide identification, but this video shows him handing you his military identification within seconds of your request. Can you explain that discrepancy?" Sullivan stammered, trying to find words, but nothing he said made sense. He claimed he might have been mistaken about the timeline, but Norton pressed him. "This is not about timeline, Officer Sullivan. You stated under oath that the defendant refused to cooperate, but the video clearly shows full cooperation. Were you lying then, or are you lying now?" Green jumped up, objecting, but Judge Monroe allowed the question, and Sullivan was forced to answer. He tried to claim that he had felt threatened despite Marcus's cooperative behavior, but his answer sounded weak and defensive. Norton continued her assault, showing the jury frame-by-frame analysis of the moment when Marcus moved. She had an expert witness on standby who testified that the movement Marcus made was a natural balance correction that any person would make when grabbed suddenly. The expert explained that it showed no signs of aggression or resistance, and that Sullivan's violent response was completely disproportionate to the situation. Norton then moved to the next phase of her attack, pulling out documents that detailed Sullivan's disciplinary history. She asked Sullivan about previous excessive force complaints, and he tried to downplay them, claiming they were all unfounded. Norton produced the actual investigation reports showing that 2 of the complaints had been sustained, and that Sullivan had been disciplined. Then Norton dropped the real bomb. She introduced evidence showing that in 2 previous cases, Sullivan had filed criminal charges against suspects claiming they had attacked him. In both cases, video evidence had later emerged contradicting Sullivan's testimony and showing that he had used excessive force. In both cases, the charges against the suspects had been quietly dropped, but Sullivan had faced no serious consequences. Norton asked Sullivan directly about these cases, and he squirmed in his seat trying to explain them away. But the pattern was clear and devastating. This was not an isolated incident. This was a police officer with a documented history of using excessive force and then lying about it to justify his actions. The jury was transfixed, and Marcus could see the shift in their attitudes. Where before they had looked at Sullivan with respect and trust, now they looked at him with skepticism and doubt. Norton kept hammering away at Sullivan's credibility, asking pointed questions about his training and his understanding of proper use of force protocols. She got him to admit that the takedown he used on Marcus was meant for situations involving active resistance or violence. She got him to admit that Marcus had not been actively resisting or violent. Then she asked the obvious question, "So why did you use that level of force on a cooperative suspect who was standing on his own property?" Sullivan had no good answer. Norton called several expert witnesses throughout the morning. A former police chief reviewed the video and testified that Sullivan's actions violated standard protocols for dealing with cooperative suspects. A use of force expert explained how the takedown Sullivan used could cause serious injury and should only be employed in dangerous situations. A video forensics expert testified about how the original footage had been deliberately degraded and explained the restoration process. Each witness added another layer to the defense's case, and by lunchtime the prosecution's version of events had been thoroughly dismantled. Green tried to object and cross-examine, but his efforts seemed desperate and ineffective against the overwhelming evidence Norton had assembled. After lunch, Norton recalled Morrison to the stand, and the younger officer looked terrified. Norton's questioning was gentler with Morrison than it had been with Sullivan, but no less effective. She asked Morrison to describe what she had actually seen that night, and Morrison's answers began to differ in small but significant ways from Sullivan's testimony. Norton pressed her on these inconsistencies, asking why her memory seemed clearer now than it had been during her original testimony. Morrison broke down, admitting that she had felt pressure to support her partner's version of events, even though she had doubts. She testified that Sullivan had told her what to say in her report, and that she had gone along with it because she was young and did not want to cause problems. The admission was damning, and several jurors looked angry at the revelation. Norton asked Morrison directly whether Marcus had been aggressive or threatening, and Morrison answered quietly that he had not. She admitted that Sullivan had been the aggressor, and that the use of force had seemed excessive to her at the time. She explained that she had not spoken up because she was afraid of retaliation, and because she trusted her more experienced partner to know what he was doing. Norton thanked Morrison for her honesty and sat down. The damage to the prosecution's case was complete. Both officers had been exposed as unreliable witnesses, and the video evidence clearly supported Marcus's version of events. Green requested a recess to confer with his office, and Judge Monroe granted it. During the break, Marcus sat with Norton and Helen, feeling overwhelmed by what had just happened. Norton explained that she had more evidence ready if needed, but that she believed the case had already turned decisively in their favor. Marcus asked why the Navy had stepped in to help him, and Norton smiled. She told him that Vice Admiral Cole had witnessed part of the trial and had decided that the Navy needed to stand up for its people. One call had set everything in motion, and now the full weight of the military legal system was behind Marcus. He felt tears threatening but held them back. After months of feeling helpless and alone, he finally had powerful allies fighting for him. When court resumed, Green stood and addressed Judge Monroe. His voice was flat and defeated as he announced that the prosecution was reviewing its case in light of new evidence and needed time to consider its position. Judge Monroe looked at him sharply and asked if he was requesting a continuance. Green hesitated and then said that he needed to discuss the matter with his superiors before proceeding. The judge was clearly unhappy with this development, but she granted a recess until the following morning. As people filed out of the courtroom, Marcus was surrounded by Navy officers congratulating him and expressing their support. Commander Bennett shook his hand firmly, and Vice Admiral Cole introduced himself, explaining that he had been watching the case and admiring Marcus's dignity throughout the ordeal. Outside the courthouse, the media swarm was intense. Reporters shouted questions about the new evidence and about the Navy's involvement in the case. Norton made a brief statement praising the thoroughness of the investigation and expressing confidence that justice would prevail. She emphasized that this case highlighted important issues about police accountability and the need for better oversight of officer conduct. Marcus stood beside her, feeling the weight lifting from his shoulders for the first time in months. The tide had turned, and everyone knew it. What had seemed like an impossible battle was now looking like a victory. Helen began her cross-examination of Sullivan with careful precision, trying to find holes in his story. She asked him to describe exactly what Marcus had done that seemed suspicious, and Sullivan gave vague answers about body language and behavior that set off his instincts. Helen pressed him on the identification issue, pointing out that Marcus had immediately provided his military identification when asked. Sullivan claimed the identification could have been fake or stolen, and that he needed to verify Marcus's identity further. Helen asked why Sullivan had not simply checked with dispatch or looked at the address on the identification, which matched the house Marcus was standing in front of. Sullivan deflected, saying that he had to make judgments based on the situation in the moment. The cross-examination continued, with Helen asking about the takedown and the use of force. Sullivan insisted that Marcus had made an aggressive move and that he had responded appropriately to protect himself and his partner. Helen tried to get Sullivan to admit that Marcus's movement had been minimal and reflexive, but Sullivan stuck to his story. He described Marcus as using military training to resist and suggested that someone with that level of combat experience posed a serious threat. Helen showed the security camera footage to the jury and asked Sullivan to point out where Marcus had attacked him. The grainy video made it difficult to see details clearly, but Helen did her best to highlight the moment when Sullivan grabbed Marcus and the minimal movement Marcus made in response. Sullivan remained calm and confident throughout the cross-examination, and Marcus could see that the officer had been through this before. He knew how to answer questions in ways that supported his report, and he knew how to appeal to the jury's natural inclination to trust law enforcement. When Helen suggested that the video quality had been degraded deliberately, Sullivan acted offended and denied any knowledge of how evidence was processed. Judge Monroe sustained an objection from Green when Helen pushed too hard on that point and warned her about making accusations without proof. Marcus felt his hope sinking further because Helen was fighting an uphill battle against an experienced officer and a system that seemed designed to believe him. During a brief recess, Marcus stood to stretch his legs, and Sullivan walked past the defense table on his way out of the courtroom. He moved close enough that only Marcus and Helen could hear his words, and his voice was low and filled with contempt. Sullivan leaned in slightly and said that Marcus's uniform meant nothing here and that nobody cared about his medals. He said that Marcus was just another criminal to him and that when the trial was over, Sullivan would make sure everyone knew what kind of man Marcus really was. The words were delivered quietly but with absolute certainty, and Marcus felt rage building inside him. Every muscle in his body tensed and his hands formed into fists on the table. Helen noticed immediately and put her hand on Marcus's arm in a gesture meant to calm him. She whispered that Sullivan was trying to provoke a reaction, and that Marcus could not give him that satisfaction. Marcus forced himself to breathe slowly and to unclench his fists, but the damage had been done. Sullivan had gotten under his skin and had reminded him that in this courtroom, his service and his sacrifice meant nothing. Marcus was just another defendant facing charges, and the system did not care about the truth of what had happened that night on his driveway. The injustice of it all pressed down on him like a physical weight, and he wondered how many other innocent people had been destroyed by officers like Sullivan. What Marcus did not see was Vice Admiral Cole, watching the exchange from the back of the courtroom. Cole had noticed Sullivan's approach and had seen the officer lean in to speak to Marcus. He had also seen Marcus's reaction and Helen's quick intervention. Cole knew exactly what was happening because he had seen it before in other cases. This was not just about one arrest or one trial. This was about a pattern of behavior and about an officer who abused his authority. Cole made a decision in that moment, and he quietly stood and left the courtroom. He walked outside into the bright afternoon sun and pulled out his phone. The call he was about to make would change everything. Inside the courtroom, the trial resumed with Morrison taking the stand as the prosecution's second witness. She was younger than Sullivan and less experienced, but her testimony was just as damaging. Morrison described the encounter in terms that matched Sullivan's report almost word for word. She said that Marcus had seemed threatening and that she had feared for her safety when he moved suddenly. She supported Sullivan's decision to use force and claimed that it had been necessary to protect both officers. Green asked her about her training and experience, and she answered in ways that made her seem professional and credible. The jury listened attentively, and Marcus could see that they believed her. Helen's cross-examination of Morrison was gentler than her questioning of Sullivan, but no less thorough. She asked Morrison to describe exactly what threatening behavior Marcus had displayed, and Morrison gave vague answers about his posture and demeanor. Helen asked if Marcus had raised his voice or made any verbal threats, and Morrison admitted that he had not. She asked if Marcus had raised his hands or made any physically aggressive moves before Sullivan grabbed him, and Morrison hesitated before saying that he had shifted his weight. Helen seized on that admission, asking Morrison to demonstrate the movement she had seen. Morrison made a small sideways step that looked completely natural and non-threatening. Helen asked if that kind of movement would normally justify a violent takedown, and Morrison fell back on saying that Sullivan had made a judgment call based on his experience. The rest of the afternoon was spent on procedural matters and technical testimony about evidence, processing, and police protocols. Marcus sat through it all feeling increasingly disconnected from the proceedings. He looked around the courtroom and saw people going through the motions of justice without any real commitment to finding the truth. The prosecutor cared about winning his case, and the officers cared about protecting each other. Even Judge Monroe, who seemed fair, was bound by rules and procedures that favored the prosecution. Marcus had faced enemy fire and had made life-or-death decisions in combat, but nothing had prepared him for this feeling of helplessness in his own country's legal system. When court adjourned for the day, Marcus and Lisa walked out, together past reporters who shouted questions that they ignored. Commander Bennett caught up with them in the parking lot and offered words of encouragement, but Marcus could hear the doubt in his voice. Bennett had been in the Navy long enough to know how these things usually ended, and his presence was more about loyalty than about confidence in the outcome. Marcus thanked him and promised to stay strong, but inside he felt his resolve crumbling. He had always believed in justice and in doing the right thing, but this experience was teaching him that belief was not always enough. That evening, Marcus sat in his backyard while Lisa put Sophie to bed. He looked up at the stars and thought about all the times he had been deployed far from home, fighting for principles he believed in. He had risked his life for his country, and for the idea that there was something worth protecting. But now he wondered if that idea was just an illusion. If the system could do this to him, then what hope did ordinary people have when they faced corrupt officers and a rigged process? Marcus felt anger and despair warring inside him, and for the first time in his life, he wondered if all his sacrifice had been for nothing. He did not know that Vice Admiral Cole had already made a call that would turn the tide, or that help was coming from a direction he never expected. All he knew was that tomorrow he would have to face more lies and more injustice, and he was not sure how much more he could take. 3 months after the trial, Marcus stood in his new office at Naval Special Warfare Command, looking out the window at the Virginia coastline. He had been promoted to commander and given responsibility for developing new training programs that would help service members navigate the challenges of returning to civilian life. The work was important and fulfilling, but Marcus knew that the real change had to happen outside the military and the civilian justice system that had nearly destroyed him. He spent his evenings working with Norton and other attorneys to push for legislative reforms that would provide better protections for service members accused of crimes and ensure that their military service was properly considered in legal proceedings. Sullivan's perjury trial took place 6 months after Marcus's case was dismissed, and the outcome was swift and decisive. The enhanced video evidence and testimony from Morrison sealed Sullivan's fate. He was convicted on 3 counts of perjury and sentenced to 2 years in prison. His conviction also triggered reviews of every case he had been involved in, and several other people who had been convicted based on his testimony saw their cases overturned. The scope of his misconduct was staggering, and it became clear that Marcus had not been the first victim, but would hopefully be the last. The police department fired several supervisors who had failed to address Sullivan's pattern of abuse and implemented new accountability measures. Marcus and Lisa decided to file a civil lawsuit against Sullivan and the police department seeking damages for the emotional distress and reputational harm they had suffered. Norton connected them with an excellent civil rights attorney who took the case enthusiastically. The lawsuit alleged that Sullivan had violated Marcus's civil rights and that the department had been negligent in supervising an officer with a known history of misconduct. The case was settled out of court for a substantial sum that Marcus donated to veterans advocacy organizations. He did not need the money, but he wanted to ensure that Sullivan and the department paid a price for what they had done and that the settlement would deter similar conduct in the future. The national attention Marcus's case had received led to congressional hearings on police accountability and the treatment of veterans in the criminal justice system. Marcus was invited to testify before a Senate committee, and he spent hours preparing his testimony with Norton's help. When he appeared before the committee, he spoke clearly and forcefully about his experience and about the systemic problems it had revealed. He described how close he had come to being convicted of crimes he did not commit, and how only the intervention of powerful allies had saved him. He emphasized that most people in his situation did not have those kinds of allies and that the system needed to be fixed so that justice did not depend on having the right connections. Several senators were moved by Marcus's testimony, and legislation was introduced to create new protections for service members in criminal proceedings. The bill required that military records and service history be considered as mitigating factors in sentencing and provided funding for legal assistance programs for veterans. The legislation also included provisions for enhanced oversight of law enforcement agencies and mandatory body cameras for all officers receiving federal funding. The bill faced opposition from some police unions but eventually passed with bipartisan support. Marcus attended the signing ceremony at the White House and met the president, who thanked him for his service both in the military and in fighting for justice reform. Life gradually returned to normal for Marcus and his family, though they were changed by the experience. Sophie, who had been traumatized by seeing her father arrested, had nightmares for months and required counseling. But slowly she healed and learned that sometimes bad things happen to good people, but that good people fight back and win. Lisa had been Marcus's rock throughout the ordeal, and their marriage was stronger for having survived the crisis together. They talked about the experience, often not to dwell on it but to process it, and to remind themselves how lucky they were. Many families in similar situations had not been as fortunate and had been torn apart by the stress and trauma of wrongful prosecution. Marcus became a sought-after speaker at military bases and veterans events. He talked about his experience, honestly describing both the trauma of being wrongfully accused and the importance of never giving up. He emphasized that service members needed to know their rights and to seek help immediately if they faced legal trouble. He praised the Navy for standing behind him and encouraged other branches to develop similar support systems for their personnel. Young sailors and soldiers approached him after his talks to share their own stories and to thank him for speaking out. Many told him that they had felt invisible and powerless, but that his example had shown them that they could fight back against injustice. 1 year after the trial, Marcus received a letter from Morrison. She wrote to apologize for not speaking up sooner and for initially supporting Sullivan's false testimony. She explained that she had been young and scared and had not understood the consequences of her silence. Morrison described how the experience had changed her and how she was now working with new officers to teach them about ethical policing and the importance of telling the truth even when it was difficult. She thanked Marcus for not destroying her career when he could have and for showing mercy to someone who had wronged him. Marcus wrote back accepting her apology and encouraging her to continue her work educating other officers. He believed that people could change and that Morrison had learned an important lesson that would make her a better officer. Vice Admiral Cole retired from active duty 2 years after the trial, but he stayed in touch with Marcus, mentoring him as he advanced in his career. Cole told Marcus that watching him handle the trial with such dignity had been one of the proudest moments of his career. He explained that making the call to Norton and setting everything in motion had been an easy decision, because some things were simply right. Cole said that leadership meant standing up for people who could not stand up for themselves, and that he would do it again without hesitation. Marcus thanked Cole for believing in him and for taking action when it mattered most. That one call had truly turned the tide, and had saved not just Marcus's life but potentially the lives of many others who would benefit from the reforms that followed. As the years passed, Marcus continued his work on policy development and training. He helped create programs that taught service members about their legal rights and connected them with resources if they faced criminal charges. He worked with civilian attorneys to establish a network of lawyers willing to take veterans' cases pro bono or at reduced rates. He pushed for better coordination between military and civilian justice systems so that service members received fair treatment. The work was never finished because new challenges constantly emerged, but Marcus found satisfaction in knowing that he was making a real difference. Every time he helped a service member avoid the kind of nightmare he had endured, he felt that his own suffering had meaning and purpose. Sophie grew up proud of her father, not just for his military service but for his courage in fighting for justice. She told her friends about how her dad had been arrested unfairly and how he had fought back and won. As she got older, she understood more about what had happened and about the larger issues of police accountability and civil rights. She decided to study law in college with plans to become a public defender, helping people who could not afford good legal representation. Marcus was proud of her choice and told her that she was carrying forward the lesson he had learned. That justice was not something that just happened, but something that people had to fight for every day. On the 5th anniversary of his arrest, Marcus sat in his backyard with Lisa, watching Sophie play with their dog. It was a warm summer evening, and the fireflies were beginning to emerge. Lisa asked Marcus if he ever regretted what had happened or wished he could go back and change it. Marcus thought about the question carefully. He told her that the experience had been devastating and traumatic, but that it had also revealed who he really was and what he believed in. It had shown him the importance of standing up for what was right, even when the cost was high. It had connected him with good people like Norton and Cole who shared his values, and it had given him a purpose beyond his military career. So no, he did not regret it, because it had made him stronger and had allowed him to help others. Marcus thought about Sullivan sometimes and wondered if the man had learned anything from his downfall. Probably not, because people like Sullivan rarely accepted responsibility for their actions, but Marcus took comfort in knowing that Sullivan could not hurt anyone else, and that the systems that had enabled him were being reformed. Change was slow and imperfect, but it was happening. Body cameras were becoming standard. Civilian oversight boards were being established. Officers with histories of misconduct were being held accountable. The reforms would not fix everything, but they would make a difference, and every person they saved would justify the effort. As darkness fell, Marcus called Sophie over and she climbed into his lap. He hugged her tight and told her that he loved her. Lisa moved closer and put her arm around them both. Marcus spent that evening at home with Lisa and Sophie, trying to process everything that had happened. The emotional whiplash from despair to hope had left him exhausted but also energized. Lisa made dinner while Sophie sat with Marcus telling him about school and trying to act like everything was normal. Marcus held his daughter close, grateful for this moment of peace after months of turmoil. He knew that the battle was not over yet, but for the first time he believed that he might actually win. Lisa watched them with tears in her eyes, understanding that they had come very close to losing everything and that only the intervention of powerful allies had saved them. For that night, Captain Norton called Marcus to discuss strategy for the next day. She explained that she expected Green to move to dismiss the charges, rather than continue with a trial that had turned so decisively against the prosecution. However, she wanted to be prepared for any possibility, including the chance that Green might try to salvage his case or push for a plea deal. Norton made it clear that Marcus should not accept any deal that involved admitting guilt. The evidence now overwhelmingly supported his innocence, and there was no reason to compromise. Marcus agreed completely. He had not fought this hard and endured this much to accept a false guilty plea just to make things easier for the system that had failed him. Meanwhile, Sullivan was dealing with his own crisis. His department had placed him on administrative leave, pending an internal investigation into his conduct. The police union was standing by him publicly, but privately union officials were worried about the national attention the case had attracted. Sullivan's history of excessive force complaints had become public knowledge, and several civil rights organizations were calling for a federal investigation into the department's practices. The political pressure was mounting, and Sullivan was quickly becoming a liability that nobody wanted to defend. His partner Morrison had been reassigned to desk duty and was cooperating fully with investigators hoping to salvage her own career. The next morning, the courthouse was even more crowded than before. News of the previous day's dramatic testimony had spread, and the case had become a national story about police accountability and the treatment of military veterans. Camera crews from major networks were set up on the courthouse steps, and protesters had gathered holding signs supporting Marcus and calling for police reform. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable as everyone waited to see what Green would do. Judge Monroe took the bench promptly at 9 and called the court to order. She asked Green if he was ready to proceed, and the prosecutor stood looking uncomfortable. Green addressed the court in a flat professional tone that barely concealed his defeat. Your Honor, after reviewing the new evidence that emerged yesterday and consulting with my office, I am moving to dismiss all charges against the defendant Marcus Hayes. The prosecution no longer believes it can prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt given the credible evidence presented by the defense. Judge Monroe looked at Green with an expression that was hard to read. She asked if this was a dismissal with prejudice, meaning the charges could not be refiled, and Green confirmed that it was. The courtroom erupted in applause and cheers from the Navy officers and supporters who had filled the gallery. Judge Monroe gavelled for order, but Marcus could see a slight smile on her face. But Judge Monroe was not finished. She accepted the motion to dismiss and then did something unusual. She addressed Marcus directly from the bench. Commander Hayes, you have endured a serious injustice over these past months. You served your country with distinction, and you deserved far better treatment than what you received. This court apologizes for the ordeal you have suffered, and I want you to know that your patience and dignity throughout these proceedings have been exemplary. The charges against you are dismissed with prejudice, and your record will be cleared. Marcus stood and thanked the judge, his voice steady despite the emotion he was feeling. Lisa was crying openly in the gallery, and Sophie was clapping with joy, not fully understanding what had happened, but knowing it was good. Judge Monroe continued speaking, and her tone became more serious. Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the county prosecutor's office for investigation into possible perjury charges against Officer Sullivan. The evidence presented in this court suggests that Officer Sullivan provided false testimony under oath, and that cannot be tolerated. I am also recommending a comprehensive review of the police department's use of force policies and training procedures. Finally, I am ordering that a copy of all proceedings and evidence in this case be forwarded to the FBI for potential civil rights violations investigation. This case has revealed serious problems that extend beyond one incident, and those problems need to be addressed systematically. The judge's words sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Sullivan, who had been sitting in the back, suddenly stood and hurried toward the exit, but reporters blocked his path, shouting questions. Green looked stunned by the judge's harsh words but said nothing. Norton stood and thanked the court on behalf of her client, and Helen Barnett added her own thanks for the judge's careful consideration of the evidence. Judge Monroe gavelled the court adjourned and left the bench. As soon as she was gone, Marcus was surrounded by well-wishers. Commander Bennett hugged him fiercely, and Vice Admiral Cole shook his hand with genuine warmth. Norton and Helen received congratulations as well for their brilliant handling of the case. Outside the courthouse, Marcus faced the media for the first time as a free man. He stood at a podium with Norton beside him and read a prepared statement. He thanked the Navy for standing behind him and providing the legal support that had made justice possible. He thanked Judge Monroe for her fairness and for taking steps to address the systemic problems the case had revealed. He spoke about the need for better police training and accountability measures to prevent other innocent people from suffering similar ordeals. He emphasized that he bore no ill will toward law enforcement in general, but that bad officers needed to be held accountable just like anyone else. He finished by expressing hope that his case would lead to meaningful reforms. Reporters shouted questions and Marcus answered several of them. He was asked if he would file a civil lawsuit against Sullivan and the police department, and he said that he was considering his options with his attorneys. He was asked how he felt about the outcome, and he replied that he was grateful for justice, but sad that it had taken so much effort and so many resources to achieve what should have been obvious from the start. He was asked what message he wanted to send to other service members who might face similar situations, and he urged them to never give up and to seek help from military legal services and veterans organizations. After about 15 minutes, Norton stepped in and ended the press conference saying that Marcus needed time with his family. Marcus drove home with Lisa and Sophie, and for the first time in months he felt like he could breathe freely. The weight that had been crushing him was gone and he could see a future again. Sophie chattered excitedly about how her daddy had won and about how the bad policeman was in trouble now. Marcus listened and smiled, grateful for her innocent perspective. Lisa held his hand tightly, and when they got home, she finally let herself cry with relief. They had survived a nightmare that could have destroyed their family, and they had come out stronger on the other side. Over the following weeks, the aftermath of the case continued to unfold. Sullivan was formally charged with perjury, and several civil rights organizations announced they were filing complaints with the Justice Department. Morrison, who had told the truth in the end, was allowed to remain with the department, but was required to undergo additional training and counseling. The police department announced sweeping reforms including mandatory body cameras for all officers, enhanced use of force training, and a new civilian oversight board. Several other officers with histories of excessive force complaints were placed under review. The changes were significant and they represented exactly the kind of systemic reform that was needed. Marcus received hundreds of messages from fellow service members thanking him for standing up and fighting back. Many shared their own stories of mistreatment by law enforcement and the difficulty of getting anyone to listen or care. Marcus realized that his case had become symbolic of a larger problem and that he had an obligation to use his platform to push for change. He began speaking at military bases and veterans events about the challenges service members faced when transitioning back to civilian life and dealing with law enforcement. He worked with Norton and other military attorneys to create a resource guide for service members facing legal trouble. He became an advocate not because he wanted to, but because he understood that his voice could make a difference. Vice Admiral Cole met with Marcus privately a few weeks after the trial. He explained that he had been following Marcus's career for years and had been impressed by his leadership and dedication. Cole told Marcus that his handling of the trial and its aftermath had only reinforced that impression. He offered Marcus a promotion and a new assignment at Naval Special Warfare Command, working on training and policy development. Marcus accepted, gratefully understanding.